I'd like to introduce Lincoln Cannon, who is a founder and the former president of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. And he's going to explain to us what the Mormon Transhumanist Association is about. And for those unfamiliar with Mormonism, I guess he will say also a few things to introduce Mormonism to us. Over to you, Lincoln.
Thank you, Julio. I'm happy to have this opportunity to present. And a good opportunity for us all to learn a little bit more about persons with different perspectives on the future and how technology and religion are combining to further. So as Julio mentioned, I'm going to take some time to share with you some information, some perspective about Mormon transhumanism. I'm a Mormon, and I'm a Mormon transhumanist, and that provides a relatively unique approach to transhumanism. Of course, most transhumanists are not Mormons. Most transhumanists, we are an unusual group, but some of the things that make us unusual may be things that persons with religious and spiritual viewpoints perspectives around consider and learn from, and perhaps in some ways transplant from Mormon transhumanism into their own religious and spiritual traditions, and further cultivate parity between transhumanism and their own worldviews. So to that end, I'm going to start, first of all, by telling you a little bit about Mormonism and humanism, how the two combine. And finally, I'll wrap up the presentation by telling you about a popular argument for faith in God that comes from religious transhumanists. It's called the New God argument. And then I'll give you a little bit of information about the Mormon Transhumanist Association itself. So first of all, regarding Mormonism, and it's, in my estimation, relatively unique among Christian faiths in that it emphasizes an immersive discipleship of Jesus Christ. Discipleship of Jesus Christ is that Mormonism isn't so much a religion about Jesus as it is an aspiration to live the religion of Jesus. So, and even raising the dead, Mormons aspire to follow that example, to take on the identity and the role of Christ with Jesus, follow Jesus' example, take on the role of Christ as in same works, to seek to console and to heal, and even, ultimately, our aspiration is to participate in helping God even raise the dead. This perspective on Christianity began with the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith. Joseph, as a young man, had visions and revelations, and revelations that he received was related to the Book of Mormon, which is a unique Book of Mormon scripture that complements the Bible. Mormons consider the Bible to be inspired scripture. Another one of Joseph Smith's revelations was him being told by God to found a church, a new church, and that's how the Mormon Church began what would later become the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. When it was first founded, it was called the Church of Christ, and over a period of time of persecution and controversy, there was something of a succession crisis. During that succession crisis, one of the leaders of early Mormonism, Brigham Young, who's pictured in the upper right corner of this slide, ended up becoming to the American West. Some of the Mormons that didn't follow Brigham Young remained in the American East, would later become the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they today call themselves the Community of Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also exist today. Their numbers are very small compared to the larger Mormon denominations, and they continue to practice polygamy, unlike most. So today in Utah and around the world, there are about 15 million Mormons that are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter. That's the Mormon denomination of which I am a member personally. Mormonism has a rather unique view on metaphysics. And it begins the universe, everything in the cosmos is both material or physical, it's a physicalist metaphysics, and everything is embodied. When I say everything, even things like real. We may not be able to see it with our unaided, unassisted eyes, but as Mormon scripture talks about it, even spirit is matter. And then even unreal and embodied in Mormonism. The God that Mormons talk about is an exalted being, an exalted human who has a material body. Unique metaphysics among Christians, not most Christians probably aren't so physicalist in their perspectives on God and spirit. Situates Mormonism that is related to this metaphysics. As Joseph Smith described it, there was no beginning. Basically, without beginning, there were gods that emerged, and they sought to institute laws whereby others could progress to become like them, to become gods themselves. And it was so, the God that created our world, our time and space, wasn't the first. Accompanying Mormonism's unique metaphysics, it also offers a relatively unique theodicy or explanation for why their myth goes before our world was created, there was a council among the gods, a council in heaven where two plans were proposed. One of the plans would be to mitigate. Another of the plans that was proposed was that we would create the world to optimize for thriving, for the opportunity to progress. The second would be far more risky and would result in much suffering along the way, but it would also produce opportunities that we wouldn't otherwise have. And as the story goes, in that decision, chose to go with the plan to optimize for thriving rather than to mitigate suffering. And this world was created and begun, and that war continues to this day on Earth as Mormons see it. Mormon eschatology, or its view of vision of change, of transformation, as Mormon prophets have described this future, echoing Christian and Jewish prophets before them. The humanity transforms. The earth becomes heaven, and humanity becomes gods, or one in God, or like God. This isn't an aspiration to replace God, but rather an aspiration to this process of change begins with a time of rapid progress in the sciences and in technology and in religious knowledge. At the return of Christ, where there is a great risk associated with the sorts of frightening prophecies that people ring of those risks, and a millennial world to follow where humanity lives in a time that surpasses our present notions of poverty or of death or of suffering. And then in that millennium, continue to love and to relate and to become more like God. And then ultimately, this world, as Mormons understand it, will become a celestial heaven, or the abode of. So that's kind of an overview of a Mormon view of how we interpret Christianity, some of our history, our metaphysics, and as you might already be starting to see, there's some unique ways in which Mormonism complements transhumanist views of the world. And I'm going to talk a little in thoughts about Mormon transhumanism. First thing to understand about Mormon transhumanism is that most Mormon transhumanists as post-secularists. Post-secularism has been described or understood in many ways, and what I mean by it is that we are not limited to either traditional or so for example, some traditional religious persons will think of religion as a supernatural worldview or as requiring belief in physical or the lawful ways in which we try to understand and explain the world. Mormon transhumanists are not limited to those sorts of perspectives on God or religion, which seek to kind of marginalize religion. And in some cases, the secular accounts are rather extreme, where they say, religion is like a failure of evolution. Account for religion in ways that kind of give up on some of its larger claims. It's more provocative claims to establishing meaning and provoking moderation in humanity. What a post-secular religious perspective seeks to do is to take the strengths of both traditional religious views and secular accounts of religion, the strengths and the knowledge and the understanding of both, to come up with a different position toward religion. For me personally, I define religion as any practice that provokes a communal strenuous mood. That's how I approach my Mormon transhumanism and my understanding of how the two come together, in that they serve to provoke me, my community, other people like me, other Mormon tranship, with our religious tradition, but also to take very seriously our relationship with the secular aspects of human culture, such as science, the art, from all of them, pull inspiration from all of them to motivate us to act on those things and to seek to change the world. So, from a post-secular perspective, propheting or foretelling, but it may be something more like forthtelling, an interactive experience where the prophet speaks to provoke, to warn people against risk, to encourage, assuming the prophet is speaking in a way that resonates with something that's in the world, some aesthetic that motivates and pulls on people, ends up helping the people transform themselves to realize those obstacles against which the prophet warns. That may be a post-secular account of of prophets, for example. And then likewise, we can come up with post-secular accounts of post-secular person might, as some Mormon transhumanists do, look at God as a being who is natural, but who also has superseded dramatically the capacity of intelligence might have, and has become what we might consider superhuman and perhaps super intelligent or super compassionate or other things. And perhaps there are these divine, these godly attributes without having to resort to any kind of anti-naturalistic explanations. So those are just some general thoughts about how religion, and it's very common for Mormon transhumanists to approach religion in ways like that. Whereas most transhumanists trace transhumanist histories, Mormon transhumanists and other religious transhumanists will point out that transhumanism has more than just a secular history, and in fact, arguably, its religious history may go back much further than its secular origins and predecessors. Some examples of this are pictured here on this slide. On the left, we've got Nikolai Fedorov, who's a priest. Nikolai Fedorov was a devout Christian, and he also advocated the use of technology to resuscitate all of humanity's ancestors. And that work, to think of such work as the kind of thing that would pull humanity together into a common task that would help us love and cooperate more with violence and war in the world, and bring us together to work on more important things. So one example there of, somebody who didn't technology as having the capacity to transform humanity in profound ways, and was approaching that because of the religious transhumanist is on the right. This is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He was a Jesuit priest, and in addition to being a Jesuit priest, he was a scientist, a paleontologist, who understood it well from a scientific perspective, but also understood evolution to be complementary to his religious and spiritual views. He saw humanity advancing both spiritually described as a noosphere, a kind of interconnected network of minds throughout the world that would increase our ability to know things, increase our ability to understand his description of the noosphere as being manifest in what we today know as the internet. He also described this noosphere progressing towards something of an omega point, or an interpretation of the return of Christ, and that this was the culmination not only of spiritual improvement but also of technological evolution. So again, another example of a person was essentially a transhumanist, although the word for transhumanism and for this idea of combining technology into our into a kind of a normal or biological evolution. He exemplifies doing this, and we've got many examples of people like this in the religious tradition of the world, where they them to be implicit transhumanists. This goes back anciently in some ways as well, if we take into consideration that humanity has long, or the idea that humanity can and should become like God or one with God. And many of these religious traditions that advocated such aspirations also encourage to participate in the work of God and help humanity toward that end. So, if the use of technology to transform humanity to become more like is among the most ancient of religious ideas. So moving more to talk about specifically Mormonism's relationship with transhumanism. It is common among situate ourselves in accelerating change, or as people have sometimes described it, as a time when Moore's manifestations are approaching a technological singularity. So as Moore's law goes, of course, the ratio of cost to complexity for computing components has been double rate, and as a consequence of that, assuming that it can continue into the future unabated for some period of time, for several decades, whether through just integrated circuits or biological computing or quantum computing, perhaps computers will empower us with the ability to do things that we never before could have imagined. Perhaps maybe computers will be more powerful than all human brains combined. Perhaps even we'll create computers, quantum computers, that could do more computing than a classical computer matter in our universe, potentially. There's a lot of speculation around where that may or may not go. But as it turns out, transhumanists, many transhumanists have this perspective. That parallels very closely a Mormon perspective on what we have in our scriptures described as the dispensation of the fullness. It appears in a few places in our scriptures, and it's associated with the idea that we live in a special time when God is revealing to humanity more knowledge and more power than ever, opportunity to use this knowledge, to use this power, to learn and to progress and to become increasingly like God. Of course, it entails making some hard choices and learning how to use this power and knowledge in a moral perspective. Another parallel between Mormonism itself, as a lot of transhumanists talk about the technological singularity, we see expressed among them the full range of apocalyptic messianic, traditionally associated with theological descriptions of the return of Christ, um, both popularly and among academic theologians, that prior to the return of Christ, there will be apocalyptic risks that we must traverse, and that as the return of Christ comes, and happens, solutions to problems that we might have. And that subsequent to this return, there will be a period of time, the millennium, when there will be great abundance, when there will be no more. These sorts of expectations and fears are, of course, regularly manifest and talked about among researchers of artificial intelligence. And so, for example, you've got people who are talking about with artificial intelligence as it surpasses humanity in its capacities. And that, of course, parallels a lot of the apocalyptic concerns of Christians. Likewise, you've got advocates of many of the problems that we're facing today. And that, of course, parallels the messianic expectations that many Christians associate with the return of Christ, as well as the millenarian expectations that once these problems are solved, that is much better than the world that we live in today, potentially. So, whether any particular person buys in to those apocalyptic, messianic, or millenarian parallel there, and Mormon transhumanists, like their secular counterparts, tend to see their religious views of the future in all of these ways, and informs the way that they position themselves, not only relative to their religion, but also relative to the technologies that that some suppose will bring about. Another parallel between Mormonism and transhumanism is simply the understanding of what transhumanity or what a transhuman may be like. And as we learn more about this notion of mind uploading, or what may be better called brain or full body emulation, we start to get these much longer than we currently live. Perhaps in bodies that are more or less biological, we could live longer as long as we learn how to repair the damage of aging that's caused over time. And then subsequent human brain perhaps map out the entire human anatomy to the extent that it's needed to reflect our identity and upload that information into a process that in parallel across many computers over very wide distances and backed up could produce a practical form of immortality. Those are not uncommon expectations among transhumanists. Mormons are rather physicalist. We don't look at spirit as something immaterial. We look at spirit as being something physical, even if it may not be something that we can just personally, and there are many other more transhumanists that see it likewise. I think of spirit as information, and I think that that the information of which I am of which I consist, the consciousness associated with that. Whether or not that consciousness is in the brain or the body is an interesting question and philosophical problem that we could debate and should debate, but can map out the brain and body and create an information replica of it. In any case, because I look at the brain and body as information that we can replicate in a computer, I see the possibility of creating, uploading them, if you will, or emulating them, and producing an essentially much more immortal body than that which we now experience. Now, some people put, that's not entirely immortal, it's not immortal, but it approaches immortality, and in a practical way. And as the systems become more redundant and reliable, and as we learn new things about how to make information persist in dependable ways, fully approach that immortality more closely. And from a Mormon perspective, you might imagine the attainment of the superlative of immortality may be no toward it, as described earlier on in my thoughts. As I mentioned, God even is, from a Mormon perspective, a physicalist Mormon perspective, continues to progress in knowledge and power. So if God, who we, for practical reasons more than anything, often describe as being omniscient or omnipotent, or having all in knowledge and power often. So that idea of omniscience or omnipotence may be more of a kind of practical assessment of our comparison to God than anything like of immortality. Perhaps it's something that we pursue, that's essentially an ideal set before us, the same way that maybe all knowledge and all power do. And then finally, another parallel between Mormonism and transhumanism is this assessment of, or what we might call post-humanity, as we transform beyond what is traditionally recognized as biologically human. Many transhumanists will look at that view, our capacities, as being, of course, tightly coupled with our computing capacities, and that eventually we may be able to compute worlds that are experientially able to use tools that some people call quantum archaeology to reach into our past and gather information from the past and bring it forward to the future to recreate the past. Those are interesting parallels, of course, to Mormon conceptions of godhood and resurrection. Mormons, as I've already described, have faith that our potential to become like God, including the creative capacities and the compassionate capacities of God. So creating worlds is something that Mormons include in their faith, in their aspirations for what humans will prove capable of doing possible through the ability to simulate worlds. And then insofar as the idea of reaching into the past, gathering information and bringing it to the future is concerned, that idea can be a means. In the Mormon tradition, some Mormon prophets have talked about how resurrection itself is an ordinance that we will eventually perform for our ancestors. And to pursue such an event, but the ideas and speculations of transhumanists might serve as grounds for starting to explore how we might approach such things. On the whole, many Mormon transhumanists argue that Mormonism actually mandates transhumanism, and this is based on our passages of Scripture to defend each of the points that are listed here on this slide that I'm showing you. But the basic idea, without belaboring it, is that our Scriptures encourage you are among the means ordained or prescribed by God for participating in God's work, and that ultimately that work is to help each other attain godhood. And because an essential attribute of godhood is this, God wants us to use science and technology to help each other attain such a glorified, immortal, physicalist body. And that's essentially an account of what transhumanism made, is to improve their intelligence, to improve their vitality. Arguably, that is an inherently transhumanist endeavor. Therefore, Mormonism, based on its scriptures, would mandate transhumanism. One of the things that Mormon transhumanism has brought to religious transhumanism, working or extrapolation from or elaboration upon some other transhumanist, secular transhumanist ideas that have a resonance with many Mormons and non-Mormons have contributed to kind of developing the relationship and transhumanist speculation about the future trajectory of technology and humanity's relationship to it. And by kind of looking at those that to some extent over the years, some of my friends and I over that period of time came up with and formulated what has come to be known as the new God argument for faith in God, a logical argument for faith in God. And it's not an argument that seeks to prove that God exists. Rather, it's an argument that proves that we should have naturalistic ways as something like superhumanity. We should trust that superhumanity already exists if we trust in our own potential to become a superhumanity. That's the gist of humanity. We should also trust that superhumanity already exists. And that argument is based on a few assumptions. The first assumption we call it the faith assumption to superhumanity. Now, not everybody, of course, will make this assumption, but most transhumanists will make this kind of assumption, and of course, most Mormon transhumanists are very comfortable making this assumption. And it's like, oh, we're assuming this because it's obvious. It's not at all an obvious assumption, but it's more of an aspiration. It's the kind of assumption that we make on practical or pragmatic grounds. It's the kind of assumption that we might have moral or practical, at least its possibility, we inspire ourselves to work toward it. And that by working toward it, we increase the likelihood or the possibility of achieving it. So that's where what the faith assumption is this basic, and it's a very simple idea that humanity won't go extinct before evolving into superhumanity. And what we mean by superhumanity in this instance is, you know, a super intelligent evolutionary descendants of present humanity. So that might include us, or the transformations of us as we who are living now might change our bodies and our brain, be our biological descendants who in turn do something like that. After making that assumption, there are a couple of sub-arguments in the new God argument. The first one uses the faith assumption along with one other assumption to argue that superhumanity probably would be more compassionate than we are. And the gist of this argument is forward, it seems likely that we're going to continue to increase in destructive capacity, and that destructive capacity is going to become increasingly decentralized. Assuming that's true, decentralized, it seems likely that we're either going to destroy ourselves as a consequence of that, destroy minimally what makes us human, or perhaps destroy ourselves in the hand. Perhaps we'll find a way to navigate the capacities, those destructive capacities, manage them, cooperate in how we use them. The gist of the compassion argument is basically that. Either we're going to figure out a way to cooperate and increase in our capacity to cooperate, or we're probably going to destroy ourselves. It's very likely that our descendants will be more compassionate or more cooperative. Compassion in this case being understood as kind of an internalized and pervasive, a more thorough cooperation, compassionate than we are, as this argument goes. The second part of the new God argument is called the creation argument. This is an extension of Bostrom's simulation argument, that if ever our descendants use vast amounts of computing power to run many emulations of our evolutionary history, then we're almost certainly already living in one of those emulations. The creation argument generalizes that across any feasible creation mechanism. So whether it's computer simulation, or maybe it's cosmoforming, or maybe it's terraforming, or whatever, if ever our descendants or we go forward to create many worlds that emulate our own evolutionary history, then we're almost certainly already living in a world that is an emulation. The second part of the new God argument, which is the creation argument. And then by combining the compassion and the creation arguments, we come to a conclusion that superhumanity probably created our world. The only alternative to this is that one of the assumptions we made on the earlier arguments is false. The key assumption being the faith assumption, in which, hey, maybe we'll destroy ourselves with our increasing destructive capacity, or through natural disaster, or some other thing. Perhaps we'll be filtered out of the universe. The new God argument doesn't deny that. But assuming we do advance on to become super intelligent, and assuming we do become superhumanity, then as the new God argument concludes, our world. Combining those things together, we reach what is, by some accounts, a description of God. And so because of our trust in our own intelligence, our own capacity to become superhumanity, it entails logically a trust that superhumanity also created our world, and that may qualify as God. In some religions, it is God. There have been some unlikely endorsements for the new God argument. On this slide, and on the left, you've got Richard, probably godlike extraterrestrials that are living in the universe right now. And the reason he calls them godlike rather than God is because, in his estimation, God through evolutionary means. But what he's saying, however, there does not apply to all theologies and all views on God. There are people, such as many Mormons, who will contend that God became God through natural means, the same as all other gods, and that we should learn how to do the same. So the kind of God that the new God argument argues for is a kind of God that even some of the most likelihood, not even merely the possibility of, Dawkins says there are very probably such gods already in existence. And then on the right, we've got Sam Harris. Sam Harris wrote a blog post a few years, discovered the arguments related to the new God argument. He commented that it gave him pause, and he recognized that something would go on and program into its world simulations various goals and various what he called, I think he called them some he was kind of just like program silly things into their worlds that would reflect their religious tendencies. And he acknowledged that this appears to be entirely possible from an evolutionary and technological perspective. While it may stand on its own feet through the assumptions it makes and the particularly among transhumanists, the likelihood that transhumanists would authority to atheists, ironically enough. All right. Some brief thoughts on the Mormon Transhumanist Association. The Mormon Transhumanist Association was founded in 2006. Since that time, early 2017, we're actually up into our membership is in the 600s. Most Mormon transhumanists are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Members of the Mormon Transhumanist Association are also theists. Most of us believe in God in some form or another. However, we do have members who are not members of the LDS. The only requirement for being a member of the Mormon Transhumanist Association is that the person support, whether or not they totally agree with or not, is not the association. And the purpose of the association is basically to advocate or to promote the Transhumanist Declaration and the Mormon Transhumanist Affirmation, which I'll show you in a moment. The Transhumanist Declaration, I'll assume that most people are familiar with that. It's a document put together by the World Transhumanist Association and Humanity Plus now for over a decade, probably approaching 15 or more years. The Mormon Transhumanist Association promotes that document. It also promotes a reimagining of the Transhumanist Declaration or aspects of it in religious and Mormon terms, and essentially advocate science and technology as being among the means for doing so. The Mormon Transhumanist Association engages in a lot of online book and at our website and through various other social media channels. And then we also promote and hold conferences like the one we're having now, keynote speakers and others who are influential in the spaces of religion, theology, and technology to come and speak and to share their perspective on spirituality. We've been doing this for quite a few years now with a lot of very positive results. And in fact, this particular conference, the India Awakens conference, the Marmody a sponsor for it as well. So with that, I think we'll go to some conversation and questions with Julio.
Thank you very much, Lincoln. That was really a great talk, and I have heard you explain all these things before, but every time I listen to you again, give me something new about. Now let me one moment to reorganize the screens to discussions. And one thing that I want to say is that though I am not a Mormon because I was not born in the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, I do consider myself a Mormon transhumanist. and I am a member of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. I have been many times at the MTA conference in April in Salt Lake City, and I do hope that I'll be able to join you guys also this year. Mm, since I'm the only one in the audience who
We
is,
hope to see you.
I hope to see you guys. Since I'm the only one in the audience who is interacting with Lincoln in real time, I think I get to ask the questions that interest me most. And these questions will be related to the speculations that I'm currently developing. I don't know if you had the opportunity to read some of my latest trends on the idea that some kind of super beings that we could call gods would naturally exist embedded the very deep structure of the fabric of reality. And I have written a few essays about that. I don't know if you had the time to read them yet, but anyway, this will be the main subject of the talk that I will give for the India Awakens conference. Therefore, listening to you, I have been very
And
interested. Uh, I interrupted you.
it's all right.
Okay, I will continue.
I think we have just a little bit of lag.
Yeah, it's not lag, it's something strange that usually doesn't happen. Your voice is kind of broken, but nothing is lost. That sometimes you say some few seconds lag, couple of seconds lag thing. I don't know if that's happening with me as well, but this doesn't usually happen. That I'll have to investigate, and I hope it's not reproduced in the video. However, the experimental method, just wait and see. Continuing where I left, I've been listening with a lot of attention to the things you said about Mormon metaphysics and the Mormon cosmology, the concept that is sometimes referred to as Mormon materialism, according to which there is no such a thing as a non-material world, and spirit itself is material and expressed in the material substrate of reality in ways that perhaps our science doesn't understand yet, but future science may understand it much better. And the idea is that sometimes, perhaps in the next century, perhaps a few millions of years in the future, but it doesn't matter because the universe is still young. Sometime in the future, we may be able to exploit our knowledge of the structure of the material world to remake the world itself as a better place and even resurrect the dead, the past. Could you elaborate a bit more on Mormon wisdom about all that?
Yeah, so from a Mormon perspective, the resurrection will ultimately be universal. Everyone will be resurrected to physical bodies that are more robust than the bodies that we now enjoy. Those bodies are glory of the sun in a more metaphorical sense. So they'll be far more glorious bodies than the bodies that we now have, but they're nonetheless associated with physicality and embodiment. in the Mormon tradition. Some of the ways that that might happen and some of the changes to our bodies that might coincide with that happening. But of course, most of those descriptions as technical matters would be concerned. But I can share with you what some of those descriptions are. So for example, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, suggested that there transfiguration for each other. And this ordinance of transfiguration would something that we would gain in what he called the last times, which in Mormon of Christ and before the millennium. So it would be in the time that we're living now, according to the Mormon perspective of eschatology. And this ordinance of transfiguration would be an ordinance that would transit into bodies that are not entirely like the bodies we will ultimately have, but maybe in a sense halfway there, that they will no longer age and as complete or as glorified as the body of God. Later on, Brigham Young describes another ordinance, and he called it the ordinance of resurrection for each other. But he described it in a way that suggested we would not gain that ordinance until later, until we were already immortal. Perhaps in this ordinance of resurrection would be applied to people whether they were dead or even the people that were still alive, and that it would transform them into yet more robust and more glorified bodies. Approach to the immortality and resurrection that Mormon prophets have talked about. One of the changes to the body that Mormon prophets have also talked about, reflection suggests at least some interesting ideas for creative consideration, is the notion that resurrected bodies will no longer have blood, spirit, replacing the blood. And this speculation or idea from Mormon prophets reflects some things in the Bible where when Jesus, Bible, after he's resurrected, he describes himself as having flesh and bone. He doesn't describe himself as having blood. And then elsewhere in the writings of Paul in the New Testament, Paul said of heaven. So combining those ideas, Mormon prophets have, in their mind at least, and from the perspective of many Mormons, explained that appearing that the bodies that we will have in a glorified resurrection will be flesh and bone bodies, but not flesh and blood bodies. The blood will be replaced by spirit, of course. But consider the notion that spirit, as some Mormon transhumanists understand it, may be information. Perhaps we can approach the notion of spirit from an informatic perspective, so to speak. Then we become information-based beings, but even information in the world that we already experience information in is always embodied. Some people have the mistaken notion to be further from the truth. Software is definitely material and embodied. It's embedded within the body of our computing devices. All of our computing devices, we could anticipate would be the case for immortal resurrected bodies, where perhaps the brain and rebuilt or transferred into these prosthetic brains and bodies. And we call that mind uploading, and perhaps at least creatively, if not some kind of interest and perspective that these prophets have talked about.
Right, and in fact, I was kind of wondering how literally we should take Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and all before them about the specifics of resurrection bodies. Now, they were speaking of bodies of flesh and bones, perhaps blood. They had not been exposed to the science that we know today, and especially they hadn't had the opportunity to read the science fiction that we read today. And in our 21st century science fiction, becoming quite familiar with concepts of extremely radical body modification that will not have that might not have flesh and bones and blood at all, could be instantiated in something like what we usually call computronium, perhaps as in the science fiction novel by Stephen Baxter that I was reading just last night. They could be physically implemented in superfluid substrate of exotic matter in neutron stars, or perhaps in the fundamental structure of the quantum vacuum itself. I mean, things that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young didn't speculate about because they didn't have the scientific notions that we have today. Wondering, what do you think they would make of this extremely exotic concept of future bodies that we are developing now? Because sometimes reading other things that they have written, I have the impression that they would be very open-minded to that.
Yeah, I think they would be that Joseph Smith in particular intentionally tried to keep his mind open to possibilities. He on one occasion, a better prophet, for example, and the way he described it was that as a person receives impressions and acts on those impressions, and he considered these impressions revelatory experiences. And it seems to me, as you know, as I've read his diaries and as I've read his prophecies and his writings, that he was very to vocalize and act on these impressions that he received, and in sometimes some very creative ways. He also lamented on occasion that some of his revelations that he provided, he lamented on one occasion that he had even been mistaken or deceived in a revelation that he had received. So Joseph Smith did seem to personally want to be in how revelation comes and what it must mean and how he should interpret it and receive it and share it over time. And he would even go so far on occasion as to say that he didn't like that you can only go this far and no further. He said that he couldn't abide living according to such a religious position because he wanted to go all the way, right? He wanted to become a god, and that setting up creedal stakes was a way of inhibiting such progress.
Okay, So I understand that your time is limited. Perhaps also the time our audience is limited. So I'm going to stop the recording now. And I'd like to thank you very much for being with us for this series of interactive books
Enjoy the
following the
opportunity to
Awakens
share this
author.
with you.